In the final months of 1943, the skies over Europe burned with contrails, fire, and loss. The United States 8th Air Force, hailed as the Mighty Eighth, had been created to bring Nazi Germany to its knees through daylight precision bombing. Yet, in practice, daylight bombing was becoming daylight slaughter. From the summer through autumn, hundreds of silver bombers droned across the North Sea each week, heading toward cities whose names soon became synonymous with death: Regensburg, Bremen, Marienburg, Schweinfurt. Inside each aircraft, 10 men endured freezing air, oxygen masks icing over, flak bursting around them like black blossoms. German radar screens lit up as formations crossed the Dutch coast. From bases at Leeuwarden, Münster, and Hanover, the Jagdwaffe scrambled to meet them. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed into the thin blue above the clouds. The first Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17, 1943, was meant to cripple Germany's ball-bearing production, an elegant theory of economic warfare. But theory met reality that day. 60 American bombers never returned. Hundreds of airmen vanished into smoke or captivity. 2 months later came the second Schweinfurt mission, October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. 291 bombers took off. 60 were lost. 600 airmen died. The Luftwaffe had learned every angle of the American approach. They attacked in waves, diving through the bomber boxes, cannon shells ripping through aluminum hulls. Gunners fought back, but the sky turned into chaos, flaming aircraft tumbling from formation, parachutes blooming over Germany. Back in England, empty bunks filled the barracks. Ground crews stopped painting names on replacement planes. Superstition replaced optimism. Pilots joked grimly that the Eighth's new motto should be, "One tour and you're done." At High Wycombe headquarters, generals faced an unbearable question. Could the daylight offensive continue? The Royal Air Force bombed by night. Perhaps the Americans would have to follow. But in Washington and London, daylight precision remained a matter of faith. The doctrine said bombers, in tight formation, were self-defending. The doctrine was wrong. Still, the Allies could not quit. Germany's factories, railways, and oil plants had to be destroyed before any invasion of Europe could succeed. Yet without long-range escort fighters, every mission into central Germany was suicide. By November, deep strike raids were suspended. The bomber campaign, intended to win the war from the sky, stood on the edge of collapse. Then, in January 1944, a new commander arrived, Major General James Harold Doolittle, a man known equally for intellect and audacity, the pilot who once performed the first blind flight in history and who had led the daring Tokyo raid in 1942. When Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force, he found an organization exhausted, disciplined, but demoralized. German defenses were tighter than ever. The Luftwaffe radar, flak batteries, and fighter coordination had reached near perfection. The Americans did have one potential trump card, a new fighter with a long, lean fuselage and a roar that could shake the air itself: the North American P-51 Mustang. Powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin and back, something no Allied aircraft had ever done. But even the Mustang was trapped by outdated doctrine. Escort fighters were ordered to stay glued to the bomber boxes, reacting rather than acting. They could protect, but not win. Doolittle saw this instantly. Wars are not won by standing guard, but by seizing the initiative. Within weeks, he would overturn years of orthodoxy, and in doing so, change the course of the entire air war.
Jimmy Doolittle's first act as commander was as simple as it was revolutionary. He gathered his fighter group leaders and told them, "Your job is not to protect the bombers. Your job is to destroy the German Air Force. That sentence detonated like a bomb across the chain of command. For months, escort groups had been ordered never to leave the formations. Now Doolittle was giving them freedom, no responsibility to hunt. Pilots who had felt like chained dogs were suddenly unleashed. Colonel Don Blakeslee of the 4th Fighter Group, Hubert Zemke of the 56th, and William Anderson of the 355th understood immediately what it meant: offense, pursuit, initiative. The new plan coincided with the Allies' preparations for the greatest invasion in history. To land in France, the skies above Europe had to be cleared of the Luftwaffe. Operation Argument, the codename for what crews would soon call Big Week, was designed to make that happen. Beginning February 20, 1944, Allied bombers would strike Germany's aircraft industry in a relentless 5-day campaign. Leipzig, Regensburg, Brunswick, Gotha, Schweinfurt, all targets designed to draw the Luftwaffe into battle. When the bomber streams crossed into enemy airspace that cold February morning, German radar screens erupted in alarm. Sirens wailed. Controllers shouted bearings to their fighter bases. Within minutes, hundreds of Bf-109s and Fw-190s were climbing into formation. For years, the Luftwaffe had dictated the terms of engagement. Now, that privilege was gone. Above the bomber streams, the Mustangs waited. Sleek, silver, and fast, they could outclimb and outdive anything the Germans sent up. Instead of hovering defensively near the bombers, they roamed ahead and above, free fighters, hunting the hunters. Dogfights flared from 25,000 feet down to the deck. Contrails twisted into white knots across the winter sky. Radio channels crackled with shouts, "Tally-ho! Bandits 3 o'clock high!" German formations dove head-on into the bombers, but Mustangs swept down in counterattack, slashing through the escorts, chasing them across their own airfields. In Regensburg, smoke poured from Messerschmitt assembly lines. At Gotha, aircraft factories burned for days. Even when bombs missed, the psychological blow was immense. The Luftwaffe was losing control of its own sky.
During Big Week, over 6,000 Allied sorties were flown. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 600 fighters, and worse, hundreds of experienced pilots, men who could never be replaced. Allied losses were high, about 260 fighters and over 200 bombers, but the arithmetic of attrition favored Doolittle. German training programs had been slashed by fuel shortages. New pilots graduated with barely 100 flight hours, few ever having fired their weapons in anger. Against them stood an endless tide of fresh American and British airmen, backed by the industrial might of 2 continents. Through March and April, Doolittle's offensive philosophy intensified. Fighter groups were encouraged to strafe enemy airfields, rail lines, anything that moved. P-47 Thunderbolts with 8.5 caliber guns shredded parked aircraft and fuel depots. Mustangs raced over highways, destroying trucks, locomotives, even individual staff cars carrying German officers. Each mission further eroded the Luftwaffe's capacity to resist. By April 1944, air battles raged over Berlin itself. The once unthinkable had become routine. Among the pilots, legends were born. Don Gentile and John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group became household names. Chuck Yeager, a young West Virginia pilot, scored his first kills in fierce engagements over France, learning lessons that would one day carry him beyond the sound barrier. Yet behind the heroism lay strategy. Doolittle's true genius was not in technology, but in psychology. He understood that if the Luftwaffe could be forced to fight daily battles of exhaustion, Germany's industrial recovery would collapse. Every downed pilot meant fewer defenders for the Reich's oil plants, fewer instructors for the next generation. By the end of April, German aircraft production was actually increasing,
But pilots were dying faster than new machines could be flown. Factories could replace metal. They could not replace experience. Big Week was only the beginning. The onslaught never stopped. Every clear day brought new waves of bombers and fighters. The Luftwaffe bled itself, trying to stop them. In the words of one German officer, "We were forced to come up again and again until nothing was left."
By May 1944, the Jagdwaffe was disintegrating. Airfields that once hummed with the sound of Daimler-Benz and BMW engines now echoed with silence. Spare parts were scarce, fuel scarcer still. Young pilots, some barely 19, took off knowing they might never land again. The transformation was visible from space had satellites existed. Where once thick webs of radar-guided interceptions had guarded the Reich, gaps now yawned open. Allied reconnaissance photos showed rows of burned aircraft and abandoned hangars. Every day, the 8th Air Force struck deeper: oil plants, ball bearing works, synthetic fuel facilities. Every night, the RAF continued the destruction. The Luftwaffe could no longer rest, repair, or regroup. In the air, Allied pilots noticed the change. German attacks that once came in disciplined waves now arrived in scattered bursts. Many enemy planes broke off after a single pass. Some fled outright. The hunter had become the hunted. By June 1944, the skies over France belonged entirely to the Allies. When the first landing craft approached Normandy, not a single German aircraft appeared over the beaches for the first critical hours. The invasion fleet moved under an umbrella of Allied aircraft so dense that German soldiers described it as an iron ceiling. Only a few Luftwaffe units attempted to intervene. Their attacks were swiftly annihilated. Of the thousands of sorties flown on D-Day, fewer than 24 belonged to the enemy. The road from Black Thursday to D-Day had been paid for in blood. Tens of thousands of airmen, hundreds of bombers, countless missions. But Doolittle's gamble had given the Allies what they needed most: command of the air. In the following months, that dominance became absolute. Mustangs and Thunderbolts roamed across France and Germany, strafing railways, columns, and even individual locomotives. Every drop of fuel destroyed, every truck burned, was another nail in the coffin of Hitler's war machine. The Luftwaffe tried to answer with new weapons: the Me-262 jet, the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet. But these arrived too late and in too few numbers. Fuel shortages kept most on the ground. Those that flew were hunted down on approach or landing. By the autumn of 1944, Allied losses had dropped dramatically, while German losses skyrocketed. In July, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly half of its remaining fighters in just 4 weeks. Training units were emptying their classrooms to fill frontline squadrons. Adolf Galland, Germany's top fighter ace and general of fighters, wrote bleakly, "We were fighting a war of extinction, and we knew who was being extinguished." Psychological collapse followed the physical one. Many German pilots no longer believed victory was possible. Some refused combat orders, others crashed deliberately to avoid capture. The skies that had once symbolized German might now symbolized its ruin.
By March 1945, when Allied armies crossed the Rhine, Luftwaffe resistance had become sporadic. The few remaining fighters were destroyed on the ground. In April, American P-51s even strafed airfields in Czechoslovakia and Austria without challenge. When the war in Europe ended, the Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, was effectively gone. Its final months had been fought by boys, its veterans buried or captured, its aircraft scattered wrecks across the fields of the Reich. Historians later counted the toll. Between February and June 1944, Germany lost over 2,600 fighters and more than 2,000 trained pilots. In that same period, the Allies achieved the impossible: continuous, unchallenged air superiority from the Channel to the Elbe. At the center of that transformation stood Jimmy Doolittle. His decision, branded reckless at first, had become the cornerstone of modern aerial doctrine. Never again would fighter escorts merely defend, they would dominate. The P-51 Mustang, once an experimental design, emerged as the symbol of victory, a machine whose grace and power embodied the turning tide of the war. In the decades that followed, air forces around the world studied Doolittle's campaign. His lesson was clear. Initiative is the ultimate defense. By taking the fight to the enemy, by refusing to react and choosing to strike first, he had rewritten the laws of air warfare. From Korea to Vietnam, from Desert Storm to the modern era, the descendants of Doolittle's strategy continued to shape the skies. Yet the story remains, at its core, one of human courage. The bomber crews who flew through walls of flak, the fighter pilots who dared to chase the enemy into his own airfields, the ground crews who patched bullet-riddled planes overnight, they turned defeat into dominance. In 1943, the 8th Air Force stood on the brink of annihilation. By mid-1944, it commanded the air over Europe. One general's audacity, one aircraft's range, and one nation's relentless will had changed history. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed not by chance, but by design, a design conceived in the mind of a man once called reckless, perhaps even mad. History would prove him right. Jimmy Doolittle's decision in January 1944 did more than win the battle for the skies. It made possible the victory on the ground that followed. In just a few weeks of fire and steel, the balance of power in the air was reversed forever. And from that moment on, every soldier, sailor, and pilot who looked upward during World War II knew the truth. The sky no longer belonged to the Reich. It belonged to freedom.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into World War II history, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories from the battlefield. Like this video if you learned something new. Share it with fellow history fans, and comment your thoughts below. Your support helps keep this history alive and brings more epic documentaries your way.